Probably not a lot.
I would say definitely 35%.
40%.
Under 30%.
11%.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
My girlfriend's a painter, and, they just don't get the breaks that men get. It's really terrible.
What percentage do you think is by Black American artists?
12, 13%.
15%? I was going to go with maybe 25%.
2.2%.
Wow! That sucks.
Welcome to the 2022 edition of the Burns Halperin Report, the largest report of its kind examining representation in the international art market and U.S. museums since 2008.
Art and culture tell us a lot about who we are as people, whose art we want to look at, whose stories we preserve, whose creations we see as valuable. Who do we hold high in society and who do we ignore? We focused on 3 distinct data sets: female identifying artists, Black American artists, and female identifying Black American artists. Our hope was to track progress.
So how bad are the figures?
They are staggeringly bad. So combined, the data sets for Black American artists and for female identifying artists represent just more than 5% of all auction sales since 2008 to midway through 2022. That's all Black American artists and all female identifying artists across all genres, periods, and time at every international auction, just more than 5% of the global total. Meanwhile, the museum data reveals that these groups combine to represent just 13.7% of all acquisitions and gifts.
So women make up 50% of the U.S. population, and Black Americans make up 13.6% of the American population. So in both cases, their representation in U.S. museums is about 1/5 of what it should be.
The figures are especially bad if you are a Black American female artist, in which case the results are about 13 times worse than they should be.
I'm Julia Halperin, an art journalist and the co-founder of the Burns Halperin Report.
I'm Charlotte Burns, an art journalist. I'm also the founder of Studio Burns and the co-creator of the Burns Halperin Report. In 2018, there were a lot of headlines about what a great time it was to be a Black American artist. First of all, there was the sale of Jean-Michel Basquiat's skull from 1982 for a record $110.5 million at Sotheby's auction house.
Thank you, Yuki. Congratulations. Thank you very much.
It wasn't the only notable success that year.
That was the first year that 7 of the 10 best-selling contemporary works at auction were by Black American artists. It was also the first year that any work by a Black artist other than Basquiat had made the top 10.
What we began to understand is that some of the things that we thought were trends maybe just stood out to us because they were different than the norm, and maybe the norm isn't really shifting.
So we decided to check. And that began a multi-year process of reams and reams of spreadsheets and a lot of time bent over laptops.
This was a far cry from our beginnings in a bar in Manhattan, and I distinctly remember saying, Julia, do you want to be like data buddies? It's kind of like gym buddies, but with data.
So this is what we've chosen to do in our free time.
It's gone on longer than we thought.
So the journey of an artwork begins in an artist's studio, and then it will often go, for the lucky ones, to an exhibition at an art gallery. And out of that art gallery, it might be purchased by an individual private collector or a museum.
We wanted to start with museums. Essentially, they're the safeguarders of culture.
There's a lot of value in looking at acquisitions because it's what museums decide to spend their money on, and it's what they keep for generations and have available to show. We got in touch with a range of museums, from the most attended museums in the United States, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to smaller community, suburban, and college and university museums, like the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. The final result was a list of 31 museums, who we all sent a very annoying email to, asking them to share with us all acquisitions of work by Black American and female identifying artists.
So let's break down those figures a little more specifically. Julia, what are the figures at the museums for these 3 different data sets? Because of course they're very distinct, they have different patterns of behavior.
Female identifying artists account for just 11% of acquisitions at museums across the US from 2008 to the end of 2020.
And even worse, progress peaked in 2009.
Black American artists account for 2.2% of all acquisitions made at U.S. museums during that same period of time. And Black women account for just 0.5%.
The situation for exhibitions is a little bit better than acquisitions, but not by much. Work by women accounts for 15% of exhibitions at U.S. museums between 2008 and the end of 2020. And for Black American artists, that figure is just under 7%.
When we first looked at these numbers, we found them so horrifying that our initial assumption was that people, when we presented them with the data, might quickly galvanize to create change. But actually, there is a tendency to disbelieve it.
One of my favorite responses is, Charlotte, these numbers for female artists are very bad. Maybe it's just because there are fewer female artists in history and working today. We went back and looked at graduation rates from top art schools and found that there had been parity in graduation for male and female artists since the early 1980s.
So encyclopedic museums have a bit more leeway here because artists have been historically excluded from schools, from systems, from mainstream markets, and all of those other things that help coalesce around the creation of value through history. But since the 1970s, especially when it comes to gender, there's really no excuse for the modern and contemporary institutions to have such dismal rates.
People in power might be surprised by the numbers, but the people affected by them are not at all.
When we interview artists, they say, I live this life. You're corroborating my lived experience. One artist notably said to us, we're crabs in a bucket. One or two may get out, but at the end of the day, we're still crabs in a bucket.
We've had 30 years, 25, 30, 35 years of consistent acquisitions, of consistent exhibitions, representing women and BIPOC artists, and nothing's changed, So clearly there's another problem. I always call it that just acquiring, or buying, right, purchasing, BIPOC and women artists is like treating the symptom, I think it's the Band-Aid on the bullet wound. In a way, it's not actually treating the underlying disease, which is white male patriarchy, in the system itself. Because the overall structure and I think foundation of the entire, arts ecosystem never changes, it remains like white, patriarchal, and capitalist. We would really have to stop buying white male art for centuries, to really level it all out.
Another explanation we often hear is that this state of play must just be representative of the makeup of boards. Boards on museums are the people who make the final call about what work gets acquired.
There's actually gender parity, essentially, in boardrooms across American museums.
So the conclusion is that it's not a question just of representation and having the right people in the rooms. It's also a question of the patriarchal system and power.
I sat in meetings for over 20 years at 5 different institutions in which routinely I had to stop the conversation to say, this list of artists we've just generated for whatever it was, exhibitions, public programs, acquisitions, were lists of men. That just happened over and over again. Even in rooms where the majority of people sitting around the table could be women. This was just the undertow, shall we say, of patriarchy is very strong.
At auction, the numbers are even worse, if you can imagine that.
So we ended up with a list of about 7,500 artists, and then we wanted to find out what kind of footprint they make in the art market. We took that list and we ran it through ArtNet's price database to figure out how much money was spent on these artists at auction between 2008 and the middle of 2022.
Let's give you some dollar values. Julia, do you want to give us the size of the total auction market from 2008 to today?
So the total size of the auction market from 2008 to the middle of 2022 is $187 billion.
And how much of that was sales of work by women?
6.2 billion.
Just to give you some context, that is worse than the market sales for just one male artist. Total sales of work by Pablo Picasso were $30 million more in the same time period than the work sold at auction for every female artist.
Total sales for Black American artists at auction are about half what Picasso generated between 2008 and the middle of 2022. The auction market for Black American female artists is so small it's almost hard to compare with any other number. Over that same period of time, their work generated about $200 million at auction.
Why are the numbers so bad? There are lots of complex reasons. These are 3 distinct data sets, each with its own patterns, behavior, history, context. But there is one unifying explanation.
Bias.
No matter how we look at the data, we keep bumping into the same ugly realities: racism and sexism.
There's a straight line between what we're taught to value and what we value, and what we think artistic genius looks like, and what we pay a lot of money for. A recent study shows a really insidious example of this. A sociologist named Renee Adams asked 2,000 wealthy men to look at images of paintings that had been created by AI and were randomly assigned the names of artists.
So we take the same painting, we assign male and female artist names to the painting, and then we ask people, how much do you like this painting? And basically we find that if the painting is associated with a female name, that certain types of participants like the paintings less. So it's male participants who are relatively more wealthy and who are more experienced in terms of their art education. So it's people who actually go and see art in sort of the public domain, who are the people who are more likely to say that they like the painting less if it's associated with a female name.
This is all obviously very bad news. However, in the data set and in our interviews with people, we do see some sparks for hope, some moments of real change.
One thing is, you don't have to be an enormous institution to make change. The best performing museums in our data set had some of the smaller budgets, between $15 and $20 million.
Another really positive thing that we can see very, very clearly is the impact of just key individuals.
One great example of this is the Dia Art Foundation in New York. If you look at our spreadsheet, you can see the year that the current director, Jessica Morgan, arrived, and you can see their proportions go up. And now they're our best performing institution with respect to work by female identifying artists, with more than 60% of their acquisitions. No change is going to stick if it's not systemic. And so what's become clear is that this is a problem that needs an industry-wide solution.
It's only going to happen if we do it together. We've learned that through doing this study. What started as us in a bar is now a multi-partner effort.
Our belief is that you can't change what you can't measure, and so at least we all have an understanding of where we are so that we can get to where we want to go.
Our hope is that this data set, as flawed and imperfect as it is a marker of a moment, and that perhaps as we all get more savvy about how to report, how to be transparent, how to track change, we can work together and have more public resources, more accountability, and from there, better futures.